The wind came from the northwest, always from the northwest, carrying snow that moved horizontally more than it fell. In the settlements along the Keweenaw Peninsula, where Lake Superior's moisture met Arctic air masses, winter wasn't a season, it was an occupation. Tom Harkin had lived in his cabin on the ridge for 11 years, and in that time he'd learned that the greatest danger wasn't the cold itself, but the accumulated small failures that cold enabled. A door that wouldn't open, a path that vanished. A moment of disorientation in white nothing. November arrived with its usual warning shots. 6 inches overnight, then 8, then a 12-inch dump that left the county roads impassable for a day. Tom's cabin sat 300 yards off what passed for a main road, connected by a drive that was really just 2 tire tracks through pine and birch. He'd chosen the location deliberately, high enough to avoid the worst valley drifts, sheltered enough by timber to break the constant wind, but not so buried in forest that a tree couldn't fall on his roof in an ice storm. The cabin itself was small, 20 by 24 feet, built solid with 8-inch walls, a steep metal roof that shed snow efficiently, and double-paned windows he'd installed himself. A wood stove in the corner, a propane backup heater for emergencies, a kitchen area with a hand pump drawing from a well that hadn't frozen yet, and a sleeping loft that stayed warmer than the main floor because heat rises and cold settles. Simple. Functional. The kind of place that worked if you worked with it. The door faced southeast, which minimized the direct assault of the prevailing winds, but created a different problem. The same northwest wind that roared across the ridge would curl around the cabin's eastern corner and deposit its load right where Tom needed to get in and out. Snow accumulated against the door in a drift that built with geometric progression, each storm adding a layer, each layer compacting the one beneath, until the door was buried under 3, 4, sometimes 5 feet of snow cemented together by wind pressure and its own weight. This had been merely inconvenient the first few winters. Tom would dig out the door, throw the snow to the sides, create a trench. It would last a few days, then another storm would fill it in. He'd dig again. This was life. Everyone did it. But in year 4, during a January whiteout that lasted 38 hours, something changed. Tom had been inside when the storm hit, which was good preparation. He had food, water, firewood stacked inside, and no reason to go out. He watched through the window as the world disappeared into a uniform white static, the pine trees at the clearing's edge vanishing, then the woodpile 15 feet from the door, then the door frame itself becoming just a rectangular shadow in the accumulated drift. When the wind finally dropped and the snow stopped falling, the silence was profound. Tom pulled on his parka, a serious piece of gear, not a fashion item, rated to 40 below with a hood that actually protected his face, and tried the door. It moved an inch, 2 inches, then stopped, held fast by the pressure of packed snow. He put his shoulder into it. Nothing. The snow wasn't powder anymore, it was consolidated drift, wind-packed into a substance with the consistency of styrofoam, but heavier, much heavier. It took him 40 minutes to dig out, working from the inside with a grain shovel, creating a narrow trench through the drift just wide enough to squeeze through. By the time he broke through to open air, his heart was hammering, his thermal underwear soaked with sweat despite the cold, and his hands were shaking, not from exertion, but from the understanding of what could have gone wrong. What if there had been a fire? What if he'd needed to get out fast? What if he'd been hurt, disoriented, unable to think clearly? The door was a single point of failure, and the snow had nearly welded it shut. That night, lying in his sleeping bag while the wood stove ticked and cooled, Tom thought about angles and wind and the way snow moved like water, flowing around obstacles, filling depressions, building where physics dictated it must build. The problem wasn't the snow itself. You couldn't stop snow. The problem was trying to fight it at the threshold, the worst possible place, where you were already inside and the snow was already winning. The solution, when it came to him around 2 in the morning, was so obvious he almost laughed. Don't fight the snow at the door. Fight it further out. Create a space where the wind's energy was already disrupted, where the drift formation happened away from where you needed to move. A corridor. Not a tunnel exactly, not some elaborate underground warren, but a roofed passage that would prevent vertical accumulation and channel the wind's energy harmlessly overhead. The snow could pile up on top of the roof. Let it, as long as the passage underneath remained clear, as long as there was a path from the door to open air that didn't require excavation every time the wind blew. The door would never be buried again. Tom spent the rest of that winter sketching ideas, watching where snow fell and where it didn't, learning the microtopography of his own doorstep. By March, when the days grew longer and the snow began to consolidate into a dense, stable mass, he had a plan. The neighbors thought he was insane. "You're gonna build what?" Jake Morrison squinted at Tom's sketch, rough pencil lines on the back of a feed store receipt, with the expression of a man watching someone propose to dig for gold in a parking lot. They were standing in the parking lot of Gunderson's General Store, the social hub of the township, where the coffee was bad and the gossip was reliable. Tom had made the mistake of mentioning his project while buying roofing nails and 2x6s. "A covered approach," Tom said, keeping his voice level. "From the door out about 15 feet, roofed, posts and beams to support it. Sides mostly open to prevent drift accumulation but with enough windbreak to disrupt the direct flow." Jake, who lived 2 miles down the valley in a house with a snowblower and a county plow driver for a brother-in-law, shook his head. "That's gonna collapse first heavy snow. You're building a cave-in waiting to happen. Not if the structure is engineered right. The roof pitch will shed the load. The posts will be braced. I'm not trying to hold up the whole winter, just provide a framework that manages the accumulation." "Manages?" Jake handed back the sketch. "You can't manage snow, Tom. It goes where it wants. You dig out, that's what you do. Everyone digs out." Carla Jensen, who'd been listening while pretending to examine cans of soup, turned around. She was in her 60s, a widow who'd been through 40 winters in this country, and had the kind of practical wisdom that came from surviving them. "Seems like a lot of work for a problem that solves itself come spring." "The problem doesn't solve itself if I can't get out my door during the storm," Tom said. "Or if there's a fire, or if I need to get to my truck and the whole area is a drift field." "You got a window," Jake pointed out. "Worst case, you go out a window." "Sure. Drop 6 feet into a snowbank, break an ankle, crawl back inside, and freeze before help arrives. Great plan." The conversation died there, the way conversations did when someone pointed out uncomfortable truths. People didn't like thinking about worst cases. Worst cases happened to other people, to the unprepared, to the unlucky. They didn't happen to you if you just kept your head down and did things the way they'd always been done. Tom bought his lumber and nails and drove home, his truck laboring through the spring melt slush. He understood the skepticism. In a place where winter was a shared hardship, there was comfort in shared methods. Everyone dug out their doors. Everyone cursed the snow. Everyone agreed it was awful and inevitable. To suggest there was a better way was to imply that everyone else was doing it wrong, and that was a social sin. But Tom wasn't interested in social comfort. He was interested in not dying because his door was buried. April and May were working months. The ground thawed enough to set posts, not into the ground itself, which would require deeper excavation than was practical. But onto concrete piers he poured into cardboard tube forms. The piers sat on gravel beds that drained well, and the posts bolted to the piers with hardware that could handle lateral wind loads and vertical snow loads in combination. The posts were pressure-treated 6x6s, spaced every 4 feet. Massive overkill for a summer porch. But this wasn't a summer porch. This was a structure that would have to bear the weight of compacted snow, endure wind gusts that could hit 60 miles an hour, and survive freeze-thaw cycles that would wreck anything not built to tolerate them. The roof structure was 2x8 rafters on a steep pitch, not the shallow slope of a normal porch, but a sharp angle that would shed snow aggressively. Tom covered the rafters with 3/4-inch plywood, then a layer of ice and water shield, then corrugated metal roofing with exposed fasteners because concealed fasteners could trap ice. The whole assembly was overbuilt by conventional standards, and that was the point. Conventional standards were for places where snow was an inconvenience. This was a place where snow was a siege weapon. The sides of the corridor were the tricky part. Fully enclosed, it would become a trap, a place where spindrift could enter but not leave, where moisture would condense and freeze, where the whole interior would gradually fill with ice. Completely open, it would offer no wind protection at all, and the drift would simply form inside the corridor instead of outside it. Tom compromised. Solid walls on the northwest and north sides, built from the same plywood as the roof and reinforced with cross-bracing. The southeast side, the lee side, he left mostly open, with just a low wall at waist height to prevent snow from blowing straight through at ground level. The idea was to create a disrupted airflow, a space where the wind lost its coherence and dropped its load before reaching the door. Would it work? He had no idea. The engineering was educated guesswork, a blend of physics he half remembered from high school and observations he'd made over a decade of winters. But it was a better guess than just accepting that the door would be buried every storm. By June, the structure was complete. It looked strange, a roofed corridor leading to a door like an entrance to a subway station or a loading dock, industrial and purposeful in a way that clashed with the rustic cabin aesthetic. Tom didn't care about aesthetics. He cared about function. He added details through the summer. A rope railing on the open side that he could grab if the footing was icy, hooks on the wall beams for hanging a lantern or a shovel, a drainage channel he cut into the dirt to prevent meltwater from pooling at the threshold. He painted the metal roof white, not for looks but to reflect summer sun and keep the space cooler when he was moving firewood through it in August. The neighbors who saw it, and they all found reasons to drive by because gossip spread fast and actual evidence spread faster, were uniformly skeptical. "Looks like a tunnel to nowhere," Jake said, standing at the end of Tom's driveway with his arms crossed, shaking his head at the structure. "First big snow, that roof's gonna pancake." Tom didn't argue. There was no point arguing. Either it would work or it wouldn't. September came, then October, and with October came the first snow. Just a dusting, an inch of white that melted by noon, but it was a reminder that the test was coming. Tom stacked firewood inside the cabin, a full cord already split and dry, and checked his supplies. Food for a month without resupply, propane for the backup heater, batteries, candles, a hand-crank radio, the kinds of preparations that seemed paranoid until you needed them, and then they seemed like the bare minimum. November's first real storm came on a Thursday night. Tom watched the weather forecast with the attention of a general studying enemy positions. Low-pressure system tracking northeast from the plains, cold air mass dropping south from Hudson Bay. The collision point, right over the Upper Peninsula. Predicted snowfall, 8 to 14 inches. Predicted wind, 20 to 30 miles per hour, gusts to 45. The snow started around 8 p.m., fat flakes falling straight down in the still air. By 10, the wind had picked up, and the flakes were coming in at an angle. By midnight, the world outside the windows was a moving white wall, and the wind was making the cabin walls creak. Tom stood at the door, the inside of the door, and listened. The wind roared past the corridor, but the sound was different now, deflected, channeled overhead rather than straight into the threshold. He opened the door 6 inches, carefully, and felt the air pressure equalize with a soft whoosh. No resistance, no wall of snow pushing back. He opened it further, a foot, 2 feet, fully open. The corridor was clear. Snow had accumulated on the roof. He could hear it up there, a soft settling sound, but the passage underneath was empty except for a fine dusting of spindrift that had made it past the windbreak wall. The railing was coated with ice, and the wind that funneled down the corridor was bitter, but the path was open. Tom stood there for a full minute, letting the cold air wash over his face, feeling the snow sting his cheeks, and allowed himself a small smile. It worked. At least for this storm, it worked. He closed the door, secured it, and went back to the wood stove to add another log. The night was long and the storm wasn't finished, but for the first time in 11 winters, he wasn't worried about being able to get out his door in the morning. By dawn, the wind had dropped to a mumble, and the snow had stopped. Tom dressed carefully, thermal underwear first, wool long johns over that, wool pants, a fleece layer, and then the parka, wool socks, 2 pairs, inside insulated boots, a wool hat that covered his ears, gloves that were actually rated for cold, not the cotton-lined junk they sold at gas stations. Dressing for winter wasn't about fashion. It was about creating layers that trapped air, wicked moisture away from the skin, and provided insulation even if they got damp. Cotton killed. It held moisture, conducted heat away from the body, and turned into a frozen shell. Wool and synthetics kept you alive. He stepped into the corridor and looked around. The roof had held. The accumulated snow on top was maybe 10 inches deep, distributed evenly across the metal panels, and the whole structure had settled perhaps an inch under the weight, but showed no signs of stress. The windbreak wall on the northwest side was plastered with snow that had frozen into a smooth, wind-carved surface, artistic in its way, a demonstration of the wind's power to shape whatever it touched. The corridor floor was mostly clear. A thin layer of snow, maybe 2 inches, had made it past the windbreak, but it was loose powder, the kind you could sweep away with a push broom. Tom did exactly that, taking his time, working methodically from the door outward to the open end of the corridor. The whole job took 5 minutes. Outside the corridor, the world was transformed. The clearing in front of the cabin had drifted unevenly, with bare patches where the wind had scoured the ground clean, and 3-foot drifts where the wind had deposited its load. The path to the woodpile was buried. The truck was a white lump with just the antenna and mirrors visible. But the door was accessible. That was the point. That was the whole point. Tom spent the morning digging out the truck and clearing a path to the woodpile, working steadily, taking breaks to warm up inside, staying hydrated. Cold was deceptive. You didn't feel thirsty when your body was focused on generating heat, but dehydration happened anyway, insidious and dangerous. He forced himself to drink water every hour, even when he didn't want it. By noon, he'd cleared the essential paths and was back inside, heating soup on the wood stove, when he heard the sound of a truck grinding up his drive. Jake Morrison's F-250, equipped with a plow blade, emerged from the trees and stopped at the edge of the clearing. Jake got out, walked over, and stood looking at the corridor with an expression Tom couldn't quite read. Not hostile, not friendly, evaluative. "So it worked," Jake said finally. "So far." "Huh." Jake walked closer, examined the structure from the side, looked up at the roof, at the windbreak wall, at the clear passage leading to the door. "How much snow you get on that roof?" "Maybe 10 inches. Could be more, it's hard to judge with drift." "And it held. It held." Jake nodded slowly. "What happens when you get 2 feet? 3? Roof pitch is steep enough it should shed most of it. But if it doesn't, I reinforce the beams. The load capacity is there." "You sure about that?" Tom shrugged. "I'm sure enough to sleep under it. If I'm wrong, I'll find out." Jake stood there a moment longer, then got back in his truck without another word. But as he turned around to leave, he gave a single nod. Acknowledgement, maybe, or respect. It was hard to tell with Jake. The rest of November brought 3 more storms, each one a test of the corridor's design. The second storm was lighter, 6 inches, less wind, and the corridor barely accumulated any snow at all. The third storm came from a different direction, swinging around from the northeast, and Tom discovered his first design flaw. Snow was able to blow in through the open southeast side and pile up against the door itself. Not a catastrophic failure. The accumulation was maybe a foot, easily cleared, but a problem that needed solving. Tom spent 2 days adding a removable panel to the southeast side, a sheet of plywood on hinges that he could swing into place when a storm was coming from that direction. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. The fourth storm was the serious one. A Alberta Clipper, the Weather Service called it, fast-moving, intense, with winds that would gust over 50 miles per hour and snowfall rates exceeding 2 inches per hour. The kind of storm that shut down highways and knocked out power. Tom prepared the way he'd learned to prepare, checking the wood stove's fuel supply, filling every container he had with water in case the hand pump froze, charging flashlights and the battery bank for his LED lanterns, cooking a pot of stew that would last 3 days if he rationed it. He closed the southeast panel and secured it with bolts. He brought in extra firewood and stacked it within arm's reach of the stove. He dressed in layers and waited. The storm hit on a Tuesday afternoon, and within an hour the visibility dropped to 0. Not poor visibility, 0 visibility. Standing at the window, Tom couldn't see the trees at the clearing's edge. He couldn't see the woodpile. He couldn't see the truck. The world beyond the glass was an undifferentiated white void, and the sound of the wind was like standing next to a jet engine. The cabin shuddered under the wind's assault. The roof groaned. The windows rattled in their frames. Tom fed the wood stove and tried to stay calm, but there was something primally disturbing about being in a small wooden box, while nature demonstrated exactly how insignificant that box was. The power went out around 6 p.m. He'd expected that. The power always went out. He lit the LED lanterns, no candles, not with the wind rattling everything, not with the risk of a flame getting knocked over, and settled in to wait. The storm lasted 30 hours. For 30 hours, the wind hammered the cabin and the corridor and everything else in its path. For 30 hours, the snow fell so thickly that it wasn't individual flakes anymore, but a flowing mass, a river of ice crystals moving horizontally through the air. Tom stayed inside, tending the fire, eating the stew, sleeping in short shifts because sleeping deeply during a storm like this felt dangerous, like you might miss some critical warning sign. On Wednesday night around 10 p.m., he heard a sound that didn't match the wind's constant roar, a sharp crack, like a gunshot, followed by a creaking groan. His heart rate spiked. Something in the corridor had failed. A beam, maybe, or a post, giving way under the accumulated load. He pulled on his parka and boots, grabbed a flashlight, and opened the door 6 inches. The corridor was dark. The storm had knocked out any ambient light, and the flashlight beam cut through swirling snow that was somehow getting inside despite the enclosed walls. He opened the door further and stepped into the passage. The cold hit him like a physical blow. Not the manageable cold of a winter day, but the savage cold of wind-driven air that found every gap in his clothing and tried to suck the heat from his core. The wind howled down the corridor, channeled by the walls into a focused stream that made his eyes water instantly, the tears freezing on his cheeks. He swept the flashlight beam across the structure. The roof was still there. The posts were still vertical. But the snow load on top was enormous, easily 2 feet, maybe 3, compacted by the wind into a solid mass. And the beams were sagging, not failing, not yet, but sagging visibly, bowing under the weight, and the strain was evident in every timber. The crack he'd heard was probably a post settling on its pier, or a beam fiber giving way, or the metal roofing buckling slightly. Not a structural failure, but a warning. Tom stood there in the howling dark, the flashlight beam barely penetrating the blowing snow, and made a decision. He couldn't unload the roof. That was impossible in these conditions. But he could reinforce the beams. He went back inside, moving quickly now, and grabbed tools. A cordless drill, lag bolts, 3 lengths of 2x4 he'd kept for repairs. Back in the corridor, he braced the sagging center beam with the 2x4s, creating temporary posts that ran from the beam to the corridor floor. Not a permanent solution. The floor would settle, the posts would shift, but enough to distribute the load and prevent a catastrophic failure before the storm ended. The work took 20 minutes. His fingers went numb despite the gloves. His face felt like it was being sand-blasted. The wind tried to rip the drill from his hands, but when he finished, the beam had stopped sagging, and the creaking had stopped. He went back inside, stripped off his outer layers, and stood by the stove until the feeling returned to his fingers. A painful process, pins and needles graduating to a deep ache. Frostbite warning signs. Numbness first, then pain, then the dangerous absence of pain when the tissue actually started to freeze. He'd caught it early. This time. The storm finally broke on Thursday morning. The wind died with eerie suddenness, and the snow stopped falling, and the world emerged from white chaos into white silence. Tom opened the door and looked out at a landscape transformed. The corridor had held. Barely. The temporary posts were leaning, and one of them had partially punched through the floorboards where the load had concentrated, but the roof was intact, and the main beams hadn't snapped. The passage was half full of snow. It had blown in from every direction, finding gaps and openings Tom hadn't known existed, but the door itself was clear. Outside the corridor, the clearing was unrecognizable. Drifts 10 feet high in some places, bare ground in others. The snow sculpted into wave patterns that looked like frozen ocean swells. The truck was completely buried. The woodpile was a white mound. The trees at the clearing's edge were bent under snow loads, and 2 of them had snapped, their tops lying in the clearing like fallen soldiers. Tom spent that day digging out and making repairs. He shoveled the snow from inside the corridor, backbreaking work, throwing each shovelful up and over the windbreak wall. He removed the temporary posts and reinforced the beam properly with permanent bracing. He found and sealed the gaps where spindrift had penetrated. He checked every bolt, every connection, looking for fatigue or damage. By evening, he was exhausted, but the corridor was functional again. More than functional, it was proven. The worst storm in years had hit it with everything nature had, and it had held. The neighbors stopped laughing after that. December came with a pattern of smaller storms, 2 or 3 inches at a time, enough to keep the ground covered but not enough to test the corridor's limits. Tom refined the design incrementally, adding small improvements. Better drainage, a rope guide system running from the door to the corridor's end so he could navigate in whiteout conditions, reflective markers on the posts so a flashlight beam would catch them even in blowing snow. The rope system was particularly important. Whiteouts weren't just about snow falling. They were about existing snow being picked up by wind and turned into a moving curtain that destroyed all sense of direction. You could be 10 feet from your door and not see it. People died within sight of their homes, disoriented, walking in circles, succumbing to cold. The rope was insurance. As long as he could grab that rope, he could find his way to the door. It ran at waist height, secured to eye bolts in the posts, and he practiced using it blind, closing his eyes and moving hand over hand to simulate whiteout conditions. It felt paranoid until he remembered that the dead had probably thought they didn't need such precautions either. Christmas week brought another major storm, this one lasting 2 days and dropping 18 inches. Tom's corridor handled it easily. The accumulated snow on the roof shed in a controlled avalanche on the 3rd morning, sliding off the steep pitch and piling up harmlessly to the sides. The passage remained clear enough that Tom only needed to spend 15 minutes with a shovel to restore full access. Meanwhile, Jake Morrison called him on the radio. Tom had a CB set up since cell service was unreliable, to say he'd been digging out his own door for 3 hours and was only halfway through. Jake's voice held no mockery, just exhaustion. "You might have had the right idea after all," Jake said. Tom didn't gloat. "It's not perfect, still finding problems, but it's better than digging out every storm." "How much did the materials cost?" "Maybe $800 plus labor." Jake was silent for a moment. "That's a lot of money." "It's a lot less than a hospital bill if I can't get out during an emergency." Yeah, I suppose that's true." The conversation ended there, but 2 days later Tom saw Jake's truck at Gunderson's, and Jake was showing people a sketch on a napkin, a rough version of Tom's corridor design. Word was spreading. January arrived with temperatures that dropped into the -20s and stayed there for a week. The cold was a different challenge than the snow. The corridor didn't help with cold. If anything, the wind channeling effect made it feel colder. But the access it provided meant Tom could get to his truck, could get to his woodpile, could get out if he needed to without spending an hour digging first. Cold this extreme required constant vigilance. Frostbite could happen in minutes. Metal tools would bond to bare skin. Moisture from breath would freeze into ice crystals in the air, creating a phenomenon called diamond dust that glittered in the sunlight and made the world look magical, until you remembered that it represented temperatures cold enough to kill you. Tom's routine became regimented. Check the wood stove every 2 hours, even through the night. Keep the fire hot enough to maintain interior temperature, but not so hot that the stovepipe glowed red. Monitor the propane backup heater's tank level. Drink water even when not thirsty. Eat high-calorie food, nuts, cheese, chocolate, dried fruit, to fuel the body's heat generation. Check extremities for numbness. Watch for subtle signs of hypothermia, confusion, clumsiness, slurred speech. Living alone in winter meant being your own safety monitor. There was no one to notice if you were acting strange, if your judgment was impaired, if you were sliding into trouble. Tom had taped a checklist to the wall by the wood stove, a reminder to check himself. Can I think clearly? Can I move my fingers and toes? Am I shivering? Is my speech normal? It felt paranoid. It was paranoid. But paranoia kept you alive. The cold snap broke in mid-January, and the temperature soared back up to the mid-20s, practically balmy by comparison. Tom used the warmth to check the corridor thoroughly, looking for stress damage from the temperature extremes. He found cracks in 2 of the posts where moisture had penetrated and expanded during freezing, and he treated them with sealant and wrapped them with metal flashing to prevent further infiltration. February brought another pattern shift. Freezing rain. The worst of all winter precipitation. Liquid water falling through air just above freezing, hitting surfaces just below freezing, and instantly turning to ice. The corridor roof became a skating rink. The windbreak walls glazed over. The rope guide system accumulated ice until the rope was an inch-thick cable, impossible to grip. Tom spent hours with a hammer and chisel, carefully breaking away the ice without damaging the structure underneath. It was tedious, exhausting work, and he began to understand that the corridor wasn't a solution. It was a different set of problems, hopefully more manageable than the original problem of a buried door. He added ice management features, a steeper pitch to the roof edges so ice would slide off more readily, salt dispensers mounted on the posts so he could spread salt without having to handle bags in the cold, a tarp system he could deploy over the rope guides to prevent ice accumulation. Each improvement was a response to a discovered failure, and each failure was a lesson. By late February, the corridor had evolved into something more sophisticated than the original design. It was no longer just a roof and walls. It was a system, a collection of interconnected elements that managed snow, ice, wind, drainage, visibility, and access. It required maintenance. It required attention. But it worked. The community's attitude had shifted from skepticism to interest. People started showing up at Tom's door, carefully navigating the corridor, which had become something of a local landmark, asking questions. How deep were the post footings? What gauge metal did he use for the roofing? How did he calculate the load capacity? Where did he get the hardware? Tom answered every question patiently. He wasn't trying to be a guru or an expert. He was just a guy who'd solved a problem, and if his solution could help someone else, that was fine. He drew sketches. He explained the physics as he understood it. He emphasized the importance of local conditions. What worked on his ridge might not work in the valley, or on a different aspect, or in a more exposed location. Carla Jensen came by in early March. She stood at the end of the corridor, looking up at the roof with the appraising eye of someone who'd built and maintained structures for decades. "You know what you did here?" she said. "Built a covered walkway? You changed the wind pattern. That's what this is, wind management. The snow was always going to fall, but you changed where it fell and how it accumulated." Tom nodded. That was the idea. Most people think of snow as the problem, but the wind is the problem. Snow just does what wind tells it to. That's about right. Carla smiled. My husband used to say the same thing. He built wind fences for the livestock pens, kept the snow from burying the gates. Everyone thought he was crazy until they saw it work. She looked at Tom. You remind me of him. Practical. I just didn't want to dig out my door every storm. Practical, Carla repeated, nodding. That's a compliment, by the way. March brought the spring pattern. Warm days, cold nights, freeze-thaw cycles that turned everything to mush, and then to ice, and then to mush again. The corridor's drainage channels earned their keep, channeling meltwater away from the door instead of letting it pool and freeze into a treacherous skating rink. Tom added gravel to the floor where the dirt had turned to mud, creating a stable surface that wouldn't turn into soup every time the temperature went above freezing. The storms were less frequent now, but more unpredictable. A March blizzard could drop as much snow as a December storm, but it would melt faster, turning into slush and creating new problems. Tom learned to adjust his maintenance routine for the changing conditions: less shoveling, more ice management, more attention to drainage. April arrived with its false promises of spring. The days were longer, the sun stronger, and the snow began its long retreat. But winter wasn't done. On April 8th, a late-season storm swept down from Canada with the kind of intensity that belonged in January. The Weather Service issued warnings 48 hours in advance. Major winter storm expected, heavy snow, high winds, possible whiteout conditions, accumulated snowfall, 16 to 24 inches. Wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour. Duration, 36 to 48 hours. Tom prepared with his usual thoroughness, but this time he noticed something different. The whole township was preparing. Jake Morrison called on the radio to check that Tom had enough propane. Carla Jensen stopped by to drop off a container of homemade soup, in case you get tired of your own cooking. The County Emergency Management Office ran a radio check, making sure everyone had working communications. It wasn't that people had suddenly become more caring. It was that the previous winter's storms had reminded everyone that isolation was dangerous and community was survival. Tom had demonstrated one approach to winter preparedness: the corridor, the systems, the methodical planning, and it had prompted others to think about their own preparations. The storm hit on a Friday night, and it was everything the forecast promised. Heavy, wet snow falling at rates exceeding 2 inches per hour, wind that started at 30 miles per hour and climbed from there, visibility that dropped to nothing as the existing snow on the ground was picked up and turned into a ground blizzard, a moving layer of white chaos. Tom's corridor performed well. The roof shed the heavy, wet snow almost as fast as it fell, and the passage remained clear. But the storm's intensity revealed a new problem. The wind was so powerful that it created pressure differentials that tried to suck the door open from the inside, or slam it shut when it was already open. Tom had to brace the door with a 2x4 to keep it from flying open unexpectedly. Around midnight, the power went out township-wide. Tom had expected this. Spring storms were notorious for taking down power lines, as the heavy, wet snow accumulated on wires and branches. He switched to lanterns and radio, monitoring the emergency frequency for updates. The radio crackled with intermittent reports. A tree down on County Road 12. Power lines down on the highway. Someone requesting welfare check on their elderly neighbor who lived alone. The normal chaos of a major storm. People doing their best to help each other under difficult circumstances. Then, around 2 a.m., a call came through that made Tom sit up and pay attention. "This is Jake Morrison calling for Tom Harkin." "Tom, you monitoring?" Tom grabbed the radio. "This is Tom. I'm here. What's the situation?" "It's Carla Jensen. She called me on the landline, said her door is completely blocked, she can't get out, and she's worried about carbon monoxide from her propane heater. I can't get my truck out. The drift in my driveway is taller than the plow blade. Can you get to her?" Tom looked out the window at the white chaos. Carla lived a quarter-mile down the road, not far under normal conditions, but in a ground blizzard at 2 in the morning it might as well be 10 miles. "I can try," Tom said. "Give me 20 minutes to gear up." He dressed with the kind of care usually reserved for high-altitude mountaineering. Base layer, insulating layer, windproof shell, face mask that covered everything except his eyes, goggles to protect against wind-driven snow, gloves with backup gloves in his pockets, a headlamp with fresh batteries and a backup flashlight, a coil of rope, a shovel, a small toolkit, a radio. Before leaving, he wrote a note and left it on the table, in case he didn't come back. Gone to help Carla Jensen, departed 2:15 a.m. If found, check Carla's place. The corridor provided shelter for the first 15 feet. but beyond that was the full force of the storm. Tom stepped out into it and immediately understood why people died in conditions like this. The wind hit him like a moving wall, pushing him sideways. The snow was so thick that the headlamp beam disappeared into white nothingness after 3 feet. The cold cut through his layers and found his core. He could not see Carla's house. He could not see his own house behind him. He could not see anything except white. Tom tied one end of the rope around a post at the corridor's entrance, an anchor point that would lead him back home. Then he started walking in what he believed was the direction of Carla's place, playing out the rope behind him, counting steps, trying to maintain a straight line in conditions that destroyed all sense of direction. 50 steps. 75. He should be at the road by now, but there was no road, just more white, knee-deep snow, and the wind that tried to push him in circles. His goggles were frosting up from his breath. His legs were burning with effort. The rope behind him was the only proof that he hadn't walked into another dimension. 100 steps. 125. He was off course. He had to be. Or Carla's house had moved. Or he was walking in circles despite the rope. His mind was starting to play tricks, offering helpful suggestions that would kill him. Maybe you should just rest for a minute. Maybe you should turn back. Maybe this is impossible. Then his outstretched hand hit something solid. A wall. Not his wall. The siding was different, rougher. He followed it hand over hand until he found a corner, then a door. Carla's door, completely buried, just as Jake had said, with a drift that had built up 4 feet high and was frozen solid. Tom dug. He dug with the shovel, with his gloved hands, with a desperate efficiency, because every minute out here was a minute closer to hypothermia or disorientation or a simple mistake that would be fatal. The snow was dense, heavy, consolidated by wind. His arms screamed. His lungs burned from the cold air. After 20 minutes, he'd cleared a trench deep enough to reach the door itself. He pounded on it. "Carla, it's Tom. Open the door." A pause. Then he heard bolts sliding, and the door cracked open, just a few inches, held by a chain. Carla's face appeared in the gap, pale and worried. "Tom, what are you doing out there? Jake said you called about being blocked in. Are you okay?" "I'm fine. The propane heater is fine. I was just worried. I didn't think anyone would actually come out in this." Tom felt a wave of relief that was almost physical. "Can you crack a window for ventilation? Just a half-inch, enough to prevent CO buildup." "Already did. Tom, you shouldn't have risked this." "I'm here now. Is there anything else you need?" "No, just be careful getting back." Tom nodded, though she probably couldn't see it in the dark. "I've got a rope leading home. I'll be fine." The trip back was somehow harder than the trip out. The wind had shifted slightly, and the rope, which should have been a straight line to safety, had developed a bow from the wind pressure. Tom followed it hand over hand, counting steps, forcing himself to move when everything in him wanted to just stop and rest. 200 steps, 250. The rope was getting shorter. He had to be close. Then, through the blowing snow, a darker shape emerged. His corridor, the roof barely visible but unmistakable. Tom stumbled into it, into the relative shelter, and almost fell with relief. He was home. Inside, he stripped off his gear with shaking hands and stood by the wood stove, letting the heat soak in. His core temperature had dropped, not dangerously, but enough that he was shivering hard, the body's natural response to heat loss. He drank hot water from the kettle he kept on the stove. He ate chocolate, nuts, cheese, forcing calories in to fuel the heat generation. The radio crackled. Jake's voice. "Tom, you there?" Tom grabbed the radio. "I'm here. Carla's fine. Door's cleared. She's got ventilation and heat." "Thank God. You okay?" "Yeah, just cold. I'll be fine." "You're crazy, you know that?" Tom almost laughed. "Yeah, I get that a lot." The storm continued through Saturday and into Sunday morning, but the worst of it had passed. By Sunday afternoon, the snow had stopped, and the wind had dropped to a mumble. Tom emerged to find his corridor had survived intact. Some snow accumulation on the roof, some drift penetration into the passage, but nothing structural. The temporary posts he'd installed after the previous big storm were still in place, still holding. The clearing was transformed again. Drifts 8 feet tall in places, bare patches in others, the sculpted chaos that extreme wind created. The rope he'd used to reach Carla's house was still there, stretching from his corridor into the white distance, half buried now but visible enough to trace. Jake Morrison showed up Sunday evening, his truck finally able to navigate the roads after the county plow had made a pass. He stood looking at the rope, at the corridor, at Tom's cabin with its plume of smoke rising from the chimney. "You could have died out there," Jake said. "Probably. But you went anyway." Tom shrugged. "She needed help." Jake was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm building one of these." He gestured at the corridor. "Maybe not as fancy, but something. You were right about the door being a single point of failure. It's a lot of work." "Yeah, well, so is digging out every storm. And so is worrying that someone's going to get trapped and die because their door is buried." Over the next few weeks, as the storm's aftermath was gradually cleared and repaired, Tom noticed more people taking an interest in winter preparedness. Not in a panicked way, but in a thoughtful way. People reconsidering their setups, their supplies, their backup plans. Jake built a covered entrance to his house, not as elaborate as Tom's, but functional, with a simple gabled roof and windbreak walls. Carla Jensen added a second exit to her house, a window converted to a door, so she'd never be trapped by a single blocked entrance. The township's emergency management office organized a winter preparedness meeting at the community center, and they asked Tom to speak. Tom wasn't a public speaker. He didn't like crowds or attention. But he showed up, and he talked about what he'd learned, the importance of redundancy, of thinking through worst-case scenarios, of building systems that worked with winter instead of fighting it. He showed pictures of his corridor, explained the engineering decisions, answered questions. The meeting turned into a conversation, with people sharing their own experiences and solutions. Someone had built a wind fence that kept their driveway clear. Someone else had installed a backup generator. Someone talked about the importance of community welfare checks during storms. What emerged wasn't a single solution or a prescribed method. It was a shared understanding that winter required respect and preparation, and that the old ways of just enduring it, just digging out and hoping for the best, might not be sufficient anymore. The storms were getting stronger. The cold snaps were getting longer. Climate patterns were shifting in ways that made traditional wisdom less reliable. Tom's corridor became a minor landmark, a conversation piece, a demonstration that engineering and thought could make life better even in harsh conditions. Visitors would stop by, not many, but some, to see how it worked, to ask questions, to think about their own situations. Tom didn't mind. He'd never intended to become a teacher or an example, but if his solution helped others think differently about their challenges, that was a good outcome. April turned to May, and the snow finally released its grip on the land. The corridor's roof shed its last accumulation in a final wet avalanche that deposited 500 pounds of slush onto the ground beside the passage. Tom shoveled it away, cleaned the gutters he'd added, checked every bolt and beam for winter damage. The structure had held through 5 months of brutal conditions. It had required maintenance, adjustment, and occasional emergency repairs, but it had never catastrophically failed. More importantly, Tom had never been trapped by a buried door. That was success. As the ground thawed and the days lengthened, Tom began planning improvements for the next winter. Better ice management, better drainage, perhaps a second exit from the cabin as Carla had done, a more sophisticated rope system for navigation, a backup power source for lights in the corridor. The work never ended. Winter always came back, but now Tom had a system, a set of tools and techniques, a body of knowledge earned through trial and error. He had turned a problem, the buried door, into a solution, and in doing so he demonstrated something important, that human beings could think their way through harsh conditions, could engineer solutions, could survive not just by enduring but by adapting. June arrived with warmth and rain, and the forest came back to life. Tom spent the summer splitting wood for the next winter, repairing his truck, maintaining his property. The corridor stood silent through the warm months, waiting. And when November rolled around again, when the first snow fell and the wind picked up and the cycle began anew, Tom was ready. He had built more than a corridor. He had built a response to winter that was thoughtful, deliberate, and resilient. He had shown that it was possible to live in harsh country without constantly fighting it, that preparation and engineering could create a margin of safety that might save your life or someone else's. The neighbors didn't laugh anymore. Some of them had built their own solutions, inspired by Tom's example, but adapted to their own situations. The community was stronger for it, better prepared, more resilient. And Tom's door never got buried again. Winter survival isn't about heroics or dramatic rescues. It's about understanding the environment, preparing methodically, and building systems that increase your margin of safety. It's about learning from failures, making incremental improvements, and never assuming you figured it all out. Tom's story is just one approach to one specific problem, but the principles are universal. Think ahead, engineer solutions, maintain your systems, and never underestimate the power of preparation. Whether you're dealing with buried doors, power outages, whiteout navigation, or any other winter challenge, the key is to turn the challenge into something you can manage. If you found this story valuable, if it made you think differently about winter preparedness or survival engineering, then I invite you to subscribe to this channel. We share true-to-life survival stories like this one. Stories that emphasize practical knowledge, realistic scenarios, and the kind of hard-won wisdom that actually keeps people alive in difficult conditions. Winter is coming, as it always does. The question is whether you'll meet it with hope and a shovel, or with preparation and a plan. Subscribe now, and let's learn together how to survive and thrive in the harshest conditions nature has to offer. The next story might be about water purification in emergencies, or navigation without GPS, or fire starting in wet conditions, real skills for real situations. Don't just survive winter, master it. Subscribe today.